Snow does not fall gently in Aldermere. It falls like ash, like something already grieving. She is on her knees in the courtyard of the Silver Hall, hands bound, when the king steps out of the crowd of armored elves and stands between her and the blade. "Strike her," says the voice behind him, old and certain, "and you save your crown. Spare her, and you lose everything you were born to protect." Elara does not look at the sword. She looks at Rowan. "You don't have to choose me," she whispers, and her voice does not shake, though her hands do. "I was never supposed to matter." He kneels in the snow beside her, in front of his entire court, in front of the law, his own bloodline carved into stone 500 years ago. "You were never supposed to matter," he says, "and yet I would burn this kingdom to ash before I let them touch you." No one in that courtyard moves. No one breathes. How did a king of Aldermere, sworn protector of the oldest law in the Elven world, end up kneeling in the snow for a human girl with no name, no title, and no right to be loved by him at all? To understand this moment, you must go back, before the crown, before the war, before a girl who believed with her whole aching heart that she was made to be overlooked. Elara had a way of disappearing in rooms full of people. It wasn't shyness, it was practice. She had learned somewhere around her 9th year that the safest place to stand was just outside the edge of everyone's attention, close enough to be fed, sheltered, tolerated, but never close enough to be seen. Seen meant remembered. Remembered meant questioned. And questions, in the village of Brackenford, always circled back to the same place. Her mother. "Your mother kept strange company," the older women would say. Not unkindly, but not kindly either. The way people speak of something they've decided long ago to be suspicious of and never bothered to reconsider. Strange company, strange ways. And no wonder she went the way she did. Elara never knew exactly what that meant, only that it meant her. Her mother, Wren, had died when Elara was 7. A fever, she'd always been told, sudden and merciless, the kind that swept through riverside towns in bad winters and took the weak and the unlucky alike. Elara remembered her mother's hands more than her face now. Hands that braided her hair too tight because they were shaking. Hands that flinched at loud knocks on the door. Hands that, every single night without fail, checked that the windows were latched before checking that Elara was asleep. She had thought, as a child, that this was simply what mothers did. It was only later, watching other families, that she understood. Her mother had not been careful. Her mother had been afraid. Of what? Elara never learned. Her father died before he could explain it. A logging accident, swift and senseless. The kind of death that leaves no answers, only an absence shaped exactly like the person who used to fill it. Grief, it turned out, was an excellent thief. It had taken the one parent who might have told her the truth and left her with a silence that calcified into a kind of permanent ache. She grew up in her aunt's house on the edge of town, fed and clothed, and never once made to feel like she belonged in either. Not unkind, her aunt, just tired and burdened and prone to reminding Elara in small ways that charity has a ceiling. There was always a portion slightly smaller, a chore assigned slightly more often, a bed by the draftiest wall. Nothing cruel enough to name, only enough to teach a child, slowly and thoroughly, that her presence in any room was conditional. She remembered once asking her aunt directly why her mother had been so afraid all the time. Her aunt's face had gone very still, the way faces do when they are deciding how much of a true thing to hand to someone too young to carry it. Some people carry weather inside them that the rest of us never see. Her aunt had said, "Your mother carried a storm. She never told me what kind. I never asked twice." It was the closest Elara ever came in 17 years to an answer. So Elara learned to want less, to need less, to take up less room in a world that had made it clear again and again that there wasn't much room being offered, she became extraordinarily good at the particular skill of disappearing in plain sight. Speaking only when spoken to, laughing a half-second after everyone else, so as not to draw notice for laughing first, choosing the seat nearest the door so she could leave a gathering without anyone marking the moment she'd left it. The village boys did not court her. The village girls did not confide in her. She was, to Brackenford, a faint shape at the edge of every memory. She had become, through years of careful practice, almost a rumor of a person. At night, alone in the draftiest room of her aunt's house, she sometimes allowed herself the dangerous luxury of imagining what it might feel like to be the center of someone's attention, instead of the edge of it, to matter the way the sun matters to the things that orbit it, helplessly and completely, rather than the way a passing cloud matters, noted only for the shade it briefly casts before moving on. She always stopped herself before the feeling went too far. Wanting things, she had learned, was a fast road to being disappointed by them. She believed not as a passing sadness, but as a foundational fact about the shape of her life, that she was the kind of person things simply happened to, not someone chosen, not someone fought for, someone who watched from the edges, while the world handed its attention to people who had been born mattering. She did not hate this life. She had simply made peace with its smallness, the way a person makes peace with a low ceiling in a room they never expect to leave. What she did not know, could not have known, was that the smallness had a reason, that her mother's fear had a name, that somewhere far beyond the borders of Brackenford, in a kingdom of silver towers and a law 5 centuries old, a single decision made before Elara was born was the reason she had grown up invisible, that the windows checked twice each night had not been the habit of an anxious woman, but the vigilance of someone who knew exactly what kind of danger might one day come knocking, and had spent every year of her daughter's childhood praying it would knock for her first. She thought she was forgettable. She was, in truth, the most dangerous secret in 2 kingdoms, and the war now creeping toward Brackenford's borders was about to drag that secret directly into the light. The war did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived the way most wars do, as rumor, then as smoke on a distant ridge, then as soldiers marching through Brackenford requisitioning grain for the eastern defense, and finally, on a gray morning in early spring, as Elven cavalry cutting through the river road faster than anyone in the village had believed elves could move. Elara was gathering water when the screaming started. She would remember almost nothing of the next hour with any clarity, the way memory blurs the worst moments into something almost merciful, except for 3 things: the smell of smoke, thick and raw, nothing like a hearth fire; the sound of her aunt's voice, cut short in a way that would haunt the edges of her sleep for months afterward; and a hand closing around her wrist and pulling her hard into the trees, just as a riderless horse thundered past the place she'd been standing only a heartbeat before. "Don't scream," the voice said. "Screaming gets you killed faster than silence does." She turned, expecting a soldier, expecting death with a face. Instead, she found herself staring at a man. No, not a man. The ears gave that away even through her panic. With eyes the pale gray of winter rivers, dressed not in raiding leathers but in armor too fine, too deliberate, to belong to an ordinary soldier. He held no weapon toward her. He held up both hands instead, slowly. The universal gesture of someone trying to prove they are not the danger in the room. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, "but you need to move. Now. Why would you help me?" The words came out sharper than fear should have allowed. "Your people did this." Something crossed his face then. Not guilt, exactly, but the shadow of it. "Not by my order," he said. "Not by my will. But yes, my people." It was the first time in her life that Elara had ever been looked at the way he looked at her in that moment. Not past her, not through her, but directly at her, as though she were the only fixed point in a burning world. She did not know then that she had just looked into the eyes of the King of Aldermere. She did not know that kings did not personally ride into border skirmishes, that some pull he could not name even to himself, had drawn him off his planned route and into these particular trees at this particular hour, a full half-day's ride from where his generals believed he was inspecting the southern garrison. She only knew that a stranger with the power to let her die had instead chosen, in the space of a single breath, to keep her alive. He got her out, through smoke, through the screaming, through a war she had no part in and no understanding of, his hand never once leaving her wrist, as though some instinct deeper than reason refused to let go of her. And when the sun finally broke through the haze of burning thatch, and they reached the relative safety of the eastern hills, he released her at last, slowly, almost reluctantly, and turned to leave without even asking her name. "Wait," she said. He stopped. "Why me?" she asked. "There were dozens of people in that village. I saw you ride past at least 3 others before you reached me. Why did you pull me out of the fire and not someone else?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he was asking himself the very same question, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he does not remember picking up. "I don't know," he admitted, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "I have led armies. I have made 1,000 decisions in worse chaos than this with perfect clarity. I have never not known something about myself before." He left her there, alive, confused, and irrevocably changed, with no name, no explanation, and a single unbearable question lodged in her chest like a splinter she could not stop touching. What happens to a girl who has spent her whole life disappearing, the moment someone finally, undeniably sees her? She did not see him again for 3 days. 3 days of searching the refugee lines that had begun forming along the river road. 3 days of asking strangers in a camp that did not yet know her name whether they had seen a tall elf with winter-gray eyes. 3 days of telling herself, with decreasing conviction, that she was only looking for him out of practical gratitude, and not because some new and frightening part of her had already decided that the single most interesting thing that had ever happened to her was a stranger choosing to see her in a burning village. She did not yet know his name was a thing entire kingdoms whispered with reverence and fear in equal measure. She only knew that for the first time in 17 years, someone had looked directly at her, and she could not stop wanting them to look again. His name was Rowan. She learned 3 days later, when he found her again at the refugee camp the elves had, to the astonishment of every human there, set up along the river to shelter those displaced by the very war his armies were fighting. He did not arrive with guards announcing his title. He arrived alone, hood up, carrying a satchel of bread he had no obligation to carry himself. "You're the king," she said, when she finally placed the face the camp had been whispering about all morning. The face on the coins. The face that did not belong on a man handing out bread like a common soldier. "I'm aware that complicates things," he said. "I'd ask you not to announce it. I find people behave strangely once they know. I behaved strangely before I knew. I called you a murderer in the woods. You weren't wrong to be afraid of me. I'd simply prefer you weren't afraid of me for accurate reasons." It was, against every instinct she possessed, the first time in years that Elara had laughed without bracing for the conversation to turn unkind. He came back the next day, and the day after. He told himself each time that it was duty. A king should see the conditions of the camps his war had created. But duty did not explain why he found himself searching the crowd for a particular face before he'd even dismounted, or why his chest unclenched every single time the moment he found it standing near the same worn supply tent at the camp's edge. Duty certainly did not explain why he began arriving earlier each visit, or staying later, or why his steward had twice now had to send a second rider to remind him of council sessions he had simply, uncharacteristically, forgotten. He learned that she did not flinch from his title the way the other humans did, not because she didn't fear elves, But because she had spent so long being unseen, that being seen, even by a king, even dangerously, felt like something she refused to apologize for wanting. She asked him questions no one in his own court had thought to ask in years. Not about strategy or succession or border treaties, but small, human things. Whether he liked the food at his own banquets, or simply ate what was set before him, because refusing would insult the kitchens. Whether he had ever, in 3 centuries of life, been allowed to be bored on purpose. He found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he did not have ready answers to questions that simple, and that not having them felt less like ignorance, and more like discovering a room in his own house he had never once thought to enter. She learned that the crown sat on him like a borrowed coat, that he carried decisions the way other men carried scars, silently, and that he had never, not once in his long life, told anyone the things he found himself telling her in the hour after sunset, when the campfires burned low and the war felt briefly, very far away. Do you know what it is to be raised knowing exactly what you'll become before you've had a single day to choose it? He asked her once, watching the river instead of her face, the way people do when the truth is easier to say to water than to eyes. Every elf I've ever loved has loved the crown first, and the man wearing it as an afterthought. My own mother used to say, the only honest mirror in the palace was the river, because it was the only thing that looked back at me and saw a face instead of a throne. I don't know anything about the crown, she said. I only know you brought me bread when you didn't have to, and you've come back 6 times when no one would have blamed you for not coming back at all. He turned to look at her then, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of a question neither of them was reckless enough to ask aloud yet, full of the particular ache of 2 people beginning, against every law of sense and circumstance, to matter to each other. It was not instant. It was not a single dramatic moment of falling. It was smaller than that, and slower, and far more dangerous for being so quiet. It was the way he began positioning himself, without noticing, between her and any soldier who looked at her too long. It was the way she started saving him the better half of whatever meager meal the camp provided, even when there was barely enough for one, and the particular stubbornness with which he always refused it, until she insisted twice. It was a hand that lingered half a second too long passing a cup. It was the particular silence of 2 people who have run out of safe things to say to each other, and are too afraid and too hopeful to say the dangerous ones. There was an evening, not long after, when a sudden storm drove the camp's fires out, and Elara found herself without dry wood and without the patience to ask anyone else for help. Rowan appeared, as he so often did now, without being summoned, and instead of simply lighting the fire himself, the way 3 centuries of casual mastery would have allowed him to in seconds, he knelt beside her in the mud and showed her slowly, patiently, how to coax flame from wet kindling herself. You don't need me to do this for you, he said, when she asked why he hadn't simply done it. You need someone to believe you're capable of doing it yourself. I would rather be that, if you'll let me. It undid something in her she had not realized was still bound shut, but even as it grew, the obstacles grew with it. An elven captain named Valon, sharp-eyed and not nearly as oblivious as Rowan hoped, began watching the king's visits to the camp with open suspicion. He was not cruel, Valon, only loyal in the particular unyielding way of a man who had served Rowan's father before him, and measured every new king against the old one's iron certainty. You are spending a great deal of time among refugees, my lord, he said one evening, falling into step beside Rowan as he left the camp. For a man who claims he is merely assessing conditions, the men are beginning to talk. Talk reaches the council faster than truth usually does. Let them talk, Rowan said with more confidence than he felt. They will not simply talk, my king. They will act. You know this better than I do. Rowan said nothing to that, because he had no answer that did not frighten him. And in the human camp, an old woman who had survived 3 wars and buried 2 husbands pulled Elara aside one evening with the particular bluntness of someone who has stopped fearing consequences. "Girl," she said, "I don't know what you think is happening between you and that elf king, but I have seen what happens to human women who let themselves be loved by powerful men in stories that were never written for them to survive. Be careful what you let yourself want." Elara said nothing. But that night, lying awake in the canvas dark, she let herself ask the question she had been avoiding since the woods. What if wanting this was the most dangerous thing she had ever done? And she wanted it anyway? If you're still here with me, subscribe to Elf Stories. There are many more unforgettable tales waiting to be told. The war ground toward an uneasy truce that spring. Not peace, not yet, but the kind of exhausted pause armies take when both sides have bled more than either anticipated. Rowan used the lull the way he used everything, deliberately, carefully, and in service of a single goal he did not yet have the courage to name even to himself. He arranged, through channels vague enough to survive scrutiny, over Elara to be brought to the outer gardens of the Silver Hall under the polite fiction of diplomatic goodwill toward displaced persons. No one believed the fiction, Valan least of all. But for a handful of weeks, in gardens older than her entire bloodline, Elara and Rowan built something neither war nor law had given permission for. He showed her the kind of small things kings are rarely permitted to share. Not the treasury, not the throne room, but the bend in the river where he used to hide as a boy when the weight of his future felt unbearable. The particular silver-blue flower that only bloomed 1 week a year and that his mother had loved before she died, defending a border that, in his private opinion, had never been worth defending. He told her, haltingly, about a father who had ruled with a closed fist and an unbending law, and a mother whose softness had been treated by that same father as a weakness to be corrected rather than a virtue to be protected. "I used to think love made rulers weak," he admitted one evening, the silver-blue flowers around them closing for the night. "I am beginning to suspect it is the only thing that has ever made me want to rule well." Elara, in turn, gave him the only thing she had ever truly owned, her own carefully guarded ordinariness. She told him about her mother's shaking hands and the windows checked twice each night. She told him about growing up at the edge of every room, about the particular loneliness of being raised by people who fed you out of obligation rather than love. She told him about wanting, just once in her life, to matter to someone the way a sun matters to the thing that orbits it, not out of duty, but because it could not imagine existing any other way. "You matter to me," he said, "in a way I do not have language sufficient to describe, and I have access to every language in this kingdom." It was the closest either of them had come to saying the word neither dared say first. There was an afternoon, late in that brief spring, when Rowan brought her not to the garden, but to a small overlook above the Silver Hall, where for one moment the entire kingdom spread out beneath them, silver towers catching the light, the river threading silver through green hills, the whole vast architecture of a life he had never once chosen and had spent 3 centuries quietly resenting. "Tell me honestly," he said, "does it terrify you, or all of this?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It should," she admitted. "A girl from Brackenford has no business standing where I'm standing. But it doesn't terrify me as much as the thought of going back to a life where no one ever looks at me the way you do. I think I've decided that's the worst fate." He took her hand then, in full view of the watchtower guards. The first time either of them had touched so openly, and neither one let go for a long time. But even as the garden weeks deepened into something neither could deny, the obstacles sharpened around them. Valan brought evidence of the visits before the king's council, not accusations. He was too careful for that, but quiet, devastating questions about where the king's attention had been spent, while half the eastern villages still smoldered. An older counselor, Lady Mirelle, raised a concern that landed heavier than any accusation, her gaze fixed on Rowan, with an intensity he did not yet understand the source of. "The law was not written out of cruelty, my king. It was written in blood. You would do well to remember whose blood. Whose blood? Rowan did not yet understand. Not fully. Not in the way he soon would. But the phrase lodged in him like a hook, the way a single ominous sentence does when you are too afraid of the answer to ask the question. He noticed, too, something he could not quite name in the way Lady Morell looked at Elara during that council session. Not suspicion exactly, the way the others looked at her, but something closer to recognition, as though she were seeing a ghost standing where a living girl ought to be. And in the human camp, word had begun to spread, distorted by fear and rumor into something uglier than the truth, that the King of Aldermere had taken a human mistress while soldiers' families starved on rationed grain. Elara began to feel eyes on her that had not been there before. Suspicious eyes, frightened eyes, the eyes of people deciding in the way crowds do that she had become someone to blame. One night, returning from the garden, she found a single word scratched into the canvas wall of her tent. Traitor. She did not tell Rowan. She told herself it was to protect him from one more burden in a kingdom already buckling under the weight of war. The truth, harder to admit, was that she was beginning to fear what loving him might cost her, and was not yet ready to know the answer. There was one more thing she did not tell him, because she did not yet understand it herself, that twice now in moments of real danger, once when a falling support beam nearly struck her during a camp storm, once when fever swept briefly through the refugee tents, her body had recovered with a speed that unsettled even her. She had always assumed she simply healed quickly. She had never once asked herself why. Each step closer they took, the ground beneath them grew thinner, and neither of them yet knew the deepest reason why. The truth did not arrive gently. Truth rarely does. It arrived in the form of Lady Morell, who summoned Elara alone to a private chamber while Rowan was occupied with council business he could not delay, and looked at her for a long searching moment with an expression Elara could not read. The chamber was small, plain by the standards of the Silver Hall, lined with old books whose spines had faded to the color of dust. Lady Morell sat with her hands folded in her lap, very still, the way a person sits when they have rehearsed a conversation many times and are still not certain they have the courage to begin it. "You have your mother's eyes," Lady Morell said at last. The words landed like a struck bell. "You knew my mother. I knew of her. Everyone of a certain age in this court knew of her once. Wren, was it not? Wren of the River House?" Elara's pulse climbed into her throat. "How could you possibly know my mother's name? She lived her whole life in a human village 3 weeks' ride from this court." Lady Morell's gaze did not waver, though her composure had begun, very slightly, to fray at its edges. "Because your mother was not human, child. Not entirely. Her mother, your grandmother, was Elven-born, a healer of this very court, named Isolde, who fell in love with a human soldier during the last great truce and chose, against the law, to leave this kingdom and live a mortal life rather than watch the man she loved grow old and die without her. She gave up her immortality. She gave up her name. She gave up everything this court had ever given her, and in return, she asked only to be left in peace. And when the council of that era discovered what she had done and what she had borne, a half-elven daughter, your mother, they did not forgive it." The room seemed to tilt. "What happened to her?" "To my grandmother. She was permitted to live in exile on the condition that her bloodline never again entangle itself with the crown. It was considered, at the time, an act of mercy. Your mother grew up knowing that condition like a second skin, knowing that her very existence was a debt owed to a council that could call it due whenever it chose. She married a human man specifically, deliberately, to ensure her own children would carry the elven blood thin enough to never matter to anyone. She thought, I believe, that she had finally broken the chain." Lady Morell's voice, for the first time, softened with something almost like grief. "She did not know that bloodline calls to bloodline, regardless of how thin you make it. When word reached this court 15 years ago that Ren's daughter had been seen with unmistakably elven instincts, sensing danger before it arrived, healing faster than any ordinary child should, a faction of this council decided the chain needed to be cut permanently before it could grow back. Elara could barely speak. The healing, the fever that came and went too quickly, the danger she had always somehow sensed a half-second before it arrived, pieces of her own life, things she had never thought to question, rearranging themselves into a shape she did not recognize and could not stop seeing now that she had seen it once. "My mother died of fever," she said, though the words felt foreign now, like reciting a story she had only just realized was a lie. "Your mother," Lady Mirelle said, with the terrible gentleness of someone delivering an unbearable mercy, "was found by agents of this court the autumn before her death. She was given a choice no parent should ever be given: surrender her daughter to the council, or protect her and pay the price herself. She chose to disappear instead, to fake an illness convincing enough that no one would look further, and to die, in truth, protecting a secret she never lived to explain to you. She spent her final months teaching you to be invisible because invisibility was the only inheritance she had left to give you that might actually keep you alive." The floor of Elara's entire life cracked open beneath her. Everything reassembled itself in an instant. The shaking hands, the latched windows checked twice each night. The years of being taught, without ever being told why, to take up as little space as possible in the world. Her mother had not been a frightened, ordinary woman swept up in grief. Her mother had been a soldier in a war Elara never knew she was fighting, and she had died still fighting it, silently, so that her daughter could live an unremarkable life. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elara whispered. "Why not before? Why not the moment I arrived in this court?" "Because I did not recognize you at first," Lady Mirelle admitted. "It was your eyes, in the end, Isolde's eyes, passed down 2 generations unbroken. I have spent 30 years hoping never to see them again, and feeling, the moment I did, an almost unbearable relief that some part of her had survived after all. Does the king know any of this?" "No," Lady Mirelle said. And here, finally, her composure cracked just slightly. "The order to hunt your grandmother's bloodline thin was given 30 years ago by the previous king, Rowan's father." The room went very still. "He has spent his entire reign trying to be nothing like the man who raised him," Lady Mirelle continued. "He has no idea that the law he is now breaking his own heart trying not to enforce is the same law his father once used to orphan a child and bury a secret beneath a fever no physician ever actually diagnosed. If the council learns who you truly are before he does, they will not see a forbidden romance to be managed. They will see the proof that the law has already failed once, and they will not allow it to fail twice." Elara understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning, the full shape of what she had stepped into. She was not simply a human girl a king should not love. She was the living, breathing evidence of exactly why the council had written that law in blood in the first place, and the reason her own mother had died, protecting a truth that was now standing directly in front of the throne it had been hidden from. "You have to tell him," Elara said. "I am not the one who should," Lady Mirelle said. "But you must, child, before the council does it for you, in front of the whole court, in a way designed to destroy you both." Elara left that chamber a different person than she had entered it. For 17 years she had believed herself ordinary, forgettable, a girl the world simply happened to. She now understood that she had never once, in her entire life, been ordinary at all. She had simply been hidden, carefully, desperately, lovingly hidden by a mother who had given everything to make sure the world never learned what Elara truly was. She did not yet know whether that truth would save her or destroy her. She only knew it could no longer stay buried. She told him in the garden beneath the silver blue flowers, on the last night they bloomed that season. She told him everything: Isolde, the exile, her mother's faked illness, the 15 years of careful invisibility that had not been instinct but inheritance. She watched his face while she spoke, and she did not look away even when his face stopped being readable at all. He listened without moving, without speaking, his face unreadable in a way she had never seen from him before. And when she finished, when the whole terrible inheritance of her bloodline lay exposed between them, he said nothing for so long that she became certain she had lost him. "My father," he finally said, his voice very low, "ordered the death of a woman for loving someone she wasn't permitted to love, and buried it as a fever. And I grew up believing he was simply strict, severe, a hard man shaped by a hard age." His voice broke on the next words. "I never imagined he was a murderer wearing the crown I now wear. I used to resent him for being cold to me. I never once imagined that the coldness was the smallest of his crimes." "You are not him," Elara said. "No," Rowan said, "but I am his son, sitting on his throne, enforcing his law, and you are standing in front of me as living proof of exactly what that law has already cost. If I choose you, Elara, I am not simply defying tradition. I am admitting publicly, irreversibly, that my father committed an atrocity, and that the very foundation of Elven law since that day has been built to cover it. The council will not call it romance. They will call it treason against the crown's own legitimacy. They will say I am unfit to rule, and worse, they may be right to fear what unraveling this means for every law built on top of it since. And if you don't choose me," he closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something in them had changed. The particular exhaustion of a man finally looking directly at a truth he has spent his whole life walking carefully around. "Then I become him," he said. "I enforce a law I now know to be soaked in innocent blood, to protect a throne that was never worth protecting at that price. I let your mother's death mean nothing. I let your grandmother's exile mean nothing. I let mine be the second generation to choose the crown over the person standing in front of me. And I will spend whatever centuries I have left knowing exactly what that choice cost, the way my father apparently never let himself know it at all. It was not a battle that could be won with swords, and both of them knew it. It was love against inheritance, truth against the comfortable silence that had protected his entire bloodline for 30 years. The boy who had grown up believing duty and goodness were the same thing, forced now to discover they were not, and never had been. "I won't ask you to burn your kingdom down for me," Elara said quietly. "I have spent my whole life being someone people were not required to fight for. I would rather disappear again than be the reason you lose everything." "That," Rowan said, taking her hands in both of his, "is exactly the lie your mother's death taught you to believe about yourself. That you are a burden to be managed rather than a person worth defending. I will not let that lie be the last thing you ever believe about your own worth. Not while I have breath to argue otherwise." The council convened within days, word of Elara's lineage having reached them, as Lady Morell had warned. Before Rowan could control the telling of it, they stood before the full court. The same courtyard from the snow, the same blade raised, the same impossible choice laid bare in front of every elf who had ever believed the old law kept them safe. Elara knelt because she was told to kneel, not because she believed she belonged there, and Rowan stood at her side, his hand never far from the hilt of a sword he had no intention of using against his own people, only against the certainty that had ruled this court for 30 years, unchallenged. "The law exists," the eldest counselor said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who has never once doubted himself. "Because love like this has cost this kingdom before. We do not write laws from cruelty, my king. We write them from grief." "The law exists," Rowan said, his voice carrying to every corner of the Silver Hall, steady despite the storm he could feel building behind his own ribs. "Because my father murdered an innocent woman and called it illness. and every one of you let him. And I have spent my entire life inheriting the silence that made that possible. I will not inherit it any longer." A murmur moved through the gathered court, like wind through tall grass. He turned to the council, to the blade, to 30 years of buried truth, standing finally in open air. "I would rather lose this crown than become the second king in my bloodline, to choose fear over the person I love. If protecting her costs me Aldermere, then Aldermere was never worth what it asked of us in the first place." The silence that followed was the longest of Elara's life. She knelt in that silence and felt, for the first time since Lady Morell's revelation, not fear, but a strange and unfamiliar steadiness. The feeling of being fought for in front of an audience large enough that the fighting could not be hidden, could not be quietly absorbed into a fever no one would ever question. It was Lady Morell finally who spoke. "Half this council," she said quietly, her voice carrying further than its volume should have allowed, "has spent 30 years grieving a truth we were too afraid to speak aloud ourselves. I knew Isolde. I called her my friend before this court, forced her into exile, and called it mercy. I have lived 3 decades with that silence sitting on my chest like a stone. I never had the courage to set down. The king is not breaking this kingdom, my lords. He is the first of us brave enough to finally heal it." One by one, swords that had been raised in judgment, lowered instead in something closer to shame. Not all of them. Valan held his ground the longest, his loyalty to the old order too deep to redirect in a single afternoon. But enough that the blade above Elara's head was finally, slowly lowered, and the law that had governed this court for 500 years cracked that day, in a way it would never fully reseal. The silver-blue flowers bloomed again the following spring, and this time Elara was there to see the whole of it, not as a refugee permitted into the garden under polite fiction, but as the woman the King of Aldermere had chosen in front of his entire court, his entire bloodline, and the law his father had once used to bury her grandmother's truth in a shallow, unmarked grave. The old law was rewritten that year, not erased. History is rarely so clean, but reshaped into something that no longer demanded silence as the price of love. Valan, in time, came to stand beside Rowan not out of changed conviction, so much as grudging respect for a king, willing to risk everything on a truth rather than rule comfortably on a lie. Some loyalties, it turned out, could be rebuilt on better foundations than the ones that first formed them. Elara visited her mother's grave before the wedding, alone, in the gray hour just after dawn, and said the things a daughter says to a parent who died protecting a truth too dangerous to speak. She told her mother she finally understood the shaking hands, the latched windows, the careful, loving lessons in invisibility. She told her she was sorry it had taken so long to understand, and grateful beyond words that it had been enough to keep her alive long enough to no longer need it. She did not feel small there anymore. She felt, for the first time in her life, like the ending of a story someone had fought very hard to make sure she survived to tell. Rowan found her there at dusk and said nothing, only took her hand, the way he had in the trees the day the world first burned, and stood with her until the cold no longer mattered. Some loves are forbidden because the people in power fear what they might prove. Elara and Rowan proved it anyway.